Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Major Steve Schiovani, who is an Army Reserve Functional Area 30 Information Operations Officer. In his civilian life, Major Schiovani works as a Department of the Air Force civilian conducting defense cyber operations as part of the 412th Communications Squadron at Edwards Air Force Base. He recently completed the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Steve Schiovani, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, John. Pleasure to be here. This is actually a pretty cool surprise to have pop up. So just a quick heads up, kind of standard disclaimer. These views are my own. They don't necessarily represent the views of the Command and General Staff College, the Department of the Army, or the U.S. government. But they are coming from, the research I did while at the Command and General Staff College.
Excellent, excellent. So stipulated. All right. So the conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Steve, will cover your master's thesis from the Command and General Staff College, which is entitled, I love the title, by the way, Lying in Wait, Competitive Deception in the Indo-Pacific. But before we get into this research, could we start by getting your overall comment about our strategic landscape?
Sure. So, one more standard disclaimer. I'm just another armchair quarterback here. Field grade officer, thinks he knows the universe. So this is kind of just my subject matter enthusiast overview here. I think we are finally starting to understand, appreciate, and kind of move inexorably towards dealing with kind of the growing complexity of our strategic landscape in a somewhat more holistic fashion. I think we still have a long way to go before we get the level of focused strategy we kind of had going in the Cold War. But at the same time, I'm kind of concerned, and I haven't seen anything to indicate this, actually quite the opposite, that we don't mirror image the fact that, yes, we need to get back to the kind of Cold War ability to have a functional grand strategy that moves from administration to administration, that our adversary or our competitors very, very different. And kind of jumping back to the contemporary look at what we're actually doing, while we, I think, kind of acknowledge, with China as our pacing adversary, but still inextricably, economically intertwined with us, we still sometimes work at cross purposes, but I think we're kind of slowly getting there, especially as China themselves actually start to run into some more large-scale strategic issues that they didn't have to deal with in the last kind of 20, 30 years.
Yeah, we've had a couple of guests here recently talk about some of those headwinds that China may be facing, which are, for example, demographic forces that are difficult to deal with, that they are going to be having to deal with, which is going to have some kind of an effect. So 100% on that. Could you tell our audience, Steve, what interested you or what inspired you to focus your research on deception in the Indo-Pacific?
Sure. So a couple different things. The deception piece just kind of came from my background in information operations. Traditionally, that was kind of part of what we did. And it's a fascinating area that is tragically underused in the U.S. military. U.S. Army specifically. So, that kind of piqued my interest right there, especially based off some operational experience. The Indo-Pacific piece, kind of twofold. One, yes, they are kind of the declared pacing adversary, kind of the big strategic boogeyman that we face. Obviously, a lot more nuance than that, but also just the not so clean cut nature of the problem. Going back to, I was saying, like, we've kind of got that multi-spectrum set of interwoven relationships between us and the PRC and all the other countries in the region that create an interesting tension where neither one of us wants conflict, and both of us, I believe, understand that armed conflict would, there's, to quote the famous movie, the only way to win is not to play. But at the same time, we're just at these loggerheads. So deception kind of provides a way, in my mind, to kind of get at those seams without, um, crossing the threshold into armed conflict. So as applied to, the nature of the problem, it kind of really, really intrigued me.
So in your reading of deception, then deception is a enabler, is a deterrence enabler, I think is what I was hearing you say almost.
So yes, it's part of it, and that's actually something I tried to get at a little bit. I had to be, the danger was this with this project was, and actually I fell foul of it, was keeping the focus on deception without getting too far afield into wider competition. But one of the things I did notice was and this was part of what I want to get at with deception, is yes, can absolutely help with deterrence, but deterrence isn't the end all be all. There are other ways to employ, the big M in support of the rest of the dime model, that aren't necessarily, force and being or threat of force, and I think deception can help there as well.
Yeah, well, I think that leads me right into what I wanted to ask you about next. And so, as part of your study, you've got a nice quote from Henry Kissinger, right up at the top. And I'll read the quote and ask you to describe how this nests within your study. And so, the quote is from Kissinger: "The objective is to increase one's options and reduce those of the adversary. The goal is less victory than persistent strategic progress." Can you comment on that?
Sure. First of all, I kind of hate myself for even breaking out a Kissinger quote, or really just a quote in general. But this one was kind of darn near perfect. And honestly,
I love quotes. Quotes are great, there's sometimes some certain people just, say something in just like a really crisp, precise way, and it's just, yes. And so I love using quotes as like a jumping off point. So sorry for the interruption. Please proceed. Yeah.
No, that's a fair point. And that's actually exactly why I chose it. I had to kind of get over myself and be like, darn, that pretty much hits the nail on the head. Regardless of your opinion on Kissinger himself, what he's getting at is, in the context of deception, as traditionally doctrinally envisioned within the US military, deception always supports usually a specific objective, usually, something along the lines of making the enemy go here so I can go there, misallocate resources, take an action or inaction, usually very discrete. But competition doesn't presuppose that there is an ending in sight, that there is no end state, and it's just kind of an infinite game. So you kind of have to reframe your mind away from like constantly achieving these fixed objectives towards, as he puts, less victory than just persistent strategic progress towards those desired future conditions. And that applies as much to, deception in this context. And actually, that's the big mind frame shift I wanted to get at with my research, getting away from specific objective to that strategic progress. And it also applies to, obviously, to wider competition and cooperation.
Right. Yeah. 100%. So I mean, this is a kind of almost a, well, maybe kind of an administrative question, but is there any meaningful or subtle difference between just deception by itself and competitive deception, as you have in the title of your study?
So my intent was definitely not to coin a new phrase. Lord knows there's enough of those out there. I think last count there's 27 different forms of deterrence that have been postulated over the years. So I wasn't so much trying to create a new phrase as to make very specific that I am not talking about the traditional or I should say, I'm going beyond the traditional definition of military deception that you'll find in doctrine, that specifically requires an XOR, that specifically deals with conflict or close to conflict, and trying to focus on, no, these are deception activities that don't assume that there is war, that we're going to war, and that that requires a necessary frame of mind shift. So trying to basically get the frame going that we're not going to be talking about, or not focusing on the traditional doctrinal definition of military deception.
Yeah, so Steve, when I was looking through your research, I was really struck about how much wargaming features prominently in this study. And by the way, to our audience, we recently had another discussion with a gentleman named Sebastian Bay, which was all about gaming as well. And so those interested in gaming and wargaming in a national security context can also check out that episode. But can you help connect the dots, Steve, between gaming and your deception research?
Sure. I guess first of all, kind of two shout outs, I guess. Two Sebastian Bay. He won't remember, but we did exchange a couple emails back and forth back while I was doing initial design on my game. So he actually kind of helped me out while I was looking at some specific rule mechanics several months back. So I was deeply appreciative of his help, and actually a lot of the work he does on the gaming side of things, his new Littoral Commander game is excellent.
Yeah, there seems to be. I'm not immersed in the military gaming. It's not really an industry, but that world. But it seems to be a really thriving, active engagement space. Do you? I mean, this may be something to comment on just in just another moment or two. But do you envision your research informing some kind of a new game?
Absolutely. So actually, that was the end product of the research. Was I had to actually build a war game. So I
Okay.
do actually have a war game that came from this, and it was actually the second shout out / inspiration I was going to give was
Okay,
to
well, there you go.
Colonel David Acosta, who you actually have had on the show before. He
Yeah.
used to be my commander, and we've kind of kept up throughout the years. And he wrote a paper a few years ago called Bodyguard of Dice at the Army War College, proposing a war game for deception. And I, read that and was like, I've been a board gamer for life. There's a couple of strategic level games I really like that have a deception flavor to them. I think there's something here.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, and we'll put a link to Colonel Acosta's episode as well. And it did not strike me that you had been engaged with him on that. That's really awesome.
Yeah, it was like I said, I got a copy of his paper, and I think we actually talked about it one day while we were out on a run. But yeah, he was he was actually the primary inspiration for the paper.
Nice. Anyway, I think I might have gotten you sidetracked just a little bit as far as discussing the gaming aspect of your research.
Sure, no worries. That actually kind of connects pretty well to the next piece. So one of the main connections, and it's actually part of the research question, is I've taken a lot of the DoD's deception planning courses, and none of them have dynamic training. They're all have to resort towards basically static plan X's and paperwork, paper planning exercises. There's nothing really out there that helps folks explore the consequences of deception besides maybe, well, not even besides, there really isn't anything. All we have is to build these static plans, get them checked against doctrine, and away we go. So one of the connections there is providing a training and education aid to make deception planning more approachable, one on an unclassified level, because classification is usually another limiter to doing kind of better training there. And two, again, actually called out in the joint concept for competition, trying to build an avenue or method of kind of experimenting and doing some of this analysis into, what's the art of the possible in terms of deception in a competitive environment. And kind of wargaming, I think, fit the bill there. It's a little difficult because the Army, unfortunately, has a very poor definition of wargaming that they use in their MDMP process, as opposed to kind of the joint and other service definitions of wargame. So sometimes makes it a little confusing. But the primary connection is wargaming's ability to analyze the decisions that are made, the information required, and the mindset of your opponent that is so critical to deception in a unclassified, dynamic, but consequences-free environment.
Right. Yeah. And how do you envision the players of the game like learning about deception as they're doing the game?
Sure. So one of the key design challenges for this one was making sure it was open to a wide audience, so that there'd be a lot of ways to build a more nitty gritty, have multiple different game boards with hidden information and lots of really fidgety rules that a grognard like myself might enjoy. But
What did you say? A what?
Grognard, old
What?
old
What's a grognard?
term for an old war gamer, old board
Okay,
gamer.
gotcha. Grognard. Okay.
Someone like me, might enjoy, but some poor E7 or O2 who's at these deception planning courses and has never played a war game in their life, probably not going to help them. So the trick was to design a game that was very approachable, but still kind of taught the key mindsets behind deception, if nothing else, even if it has to abstract out a lot of other things to keep it approachable and open to the widest audience in a relatively short amount of time. Still hit the major mindsets of one, understanding your target first and foremost, because the whole point is to get your target to make a decision that you want them to make without them realizing it. And if you don't know your target intimately, and this is a place, without going into detail, that the Army, the military writ large, is not great at, without knowing your target in detail, it's hard to manipulate them. And so, the board game aspect gives you not just the physical pieces and how the person is kind of manipulating the game pieces to understand their patterns of behavior, but also if you know the person themselves. I know I have my own tells when I play games, and my opponents who have played me, they can look at those and they can either attempt to manipulate them, or I can use my own player profile to attempt to manipulate my own adversary. So it provides that kind of target analysis piece. And then the actual game itself focuses a lot on decision cycles and hidden information, and that kind of tension between I have an objective I need to complete, and I can't clue my opponent into it because then they will be able to counter it fairly easily. But then I also have to keep in mind what the opponent is doing. So forcing people to think about their limited resources, the nature of the hidden information on the game board, and their own decision cycle and that of their adversary. How to get them to do what they want them to do to benefit their own goals.
Wow. Yeah. 100%. You were, what I was hearing you describe was the Soviet concept of reflexive control. And I'm not sure whether you came across that in your research, but it's essentially knowing your opponent sufficiently to be able to know in advance how they are likely to respond to various different stimuli or provocations or messages. And if you know in advance how they're going to respond, then you are essentially controlling the situation.
Absolutely. So yeah, reflection actually did come up in my came up in my research. One of the first things I tried to do before actually diving into the game design was kind of build a first principles model of deception, from individual cognition up to organizational decision making through the cultural lens, and then splitting off from that agnostic piece to various cultural lenses, specifically the US and China. But the reflection piece did actually kind of come up during the universal principles of deception research component, and that's kind of, without repeating what you said, that's the crux of it.
Yeah, very cool. Well, so just kind of wrapping up here before we go into a lightning round, Stephen. So you conclude what I reviewed anyway with a slightly humorous but also telling, I'll call it a vignette from The Lord of the Rings, which probably a lot of people in our audience are familiar with. But could you recap this story and the cautionary message that you think relates to deception and the environment that we find ourselves in right now?
Sure, absolutely. So, obviously, a big part of it is I just self-professed Lord of the Rings nerd, but I actually chose this specifically because I wanted to illustrate, to a U.S. audience, to a U.S. military audience, just how much deception actually shows up in places. And the U.S. military does itself no favors relegating it to the position we have. And I'll have to go slightly off question here just for a second.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
We talk about all the updated doctrine talks about deception dozens and dozens and dozens of times, 50 plus times in the new FM 3.0 alone, but there is nothing backing it up in implementation. Non-attributional, someone said, it's aspirational. We have some decent tactical deception doctrine, but nothing else backing it up. And this is actually the fifth time I think I've come up through my research that the Army has tried to invigorate some kind of belief in the power of manipulation and deception in military and other military operations. They just haven't. So I chose this specifically as kind of a jolting or kind of unusual, something to get people's attention to just how much this sort of thing actually does show up all over the place, and we're not doing ourselves any favor. And in this case, even showing up in The Lord of the Rings, a piece of fiction written in from the 30s through the 50s, that would otherwise seem to have nothing to do with competitive deception, and yet there is a part of the story where Frodo, knowing that he is under threat, plans over the course of, I think, several months or several years, a deception in which he intends to make it look like he will be simply moving to another part of the Shire. He purchases a new house. He has all his friends go out and spread the messages, so multiple forms of deception. He commits the resources to buying the new house, and basically sets this pattern of life to make it look like that's what he's going to go do, when in reality, he's going to take an alternate route out of the Shire, to go onwards, with the rest of his quest. And again, this whole thing happens outside of conflict, and could be, construed as being conducted at the strategic level, I guess the Shire might be. And it just kind of points out where these things can pop up and how useful they can be, outside of the traditional domain of, where Army planners tend to think like, hey, how can I use deception to help cross a river during an operation, or to use the tired old Port de Calais, Operation Fortitude example, just trying to get people to look at those other aspects, basically.
Right. And so your caution is that we don't want to do all the right things only to fumble the ball as we're getting close to the goal line. Or I'm mixing all kinds of metaphors there, probably, but something like that.
You nailed it. Nailed it. Yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot at the very end of the story, for all that planning, Frodo does, a number of OPSEC and planning issues, eerily similar to what the Army sometimes faces, causes the whole plan to go awry and does not succeed as intended. And I saw a lot of parallels between, our enormous capacity for planning and generating, all these options, but then, failure to execute for one reason or another.
Right. Yeah. 100% on all that. And, this whole topic space, well, the topic space of influence in general and information operations and competition, all of it requires a deep thinking and patience to let the influence work over the mid to long term. And so something that I've learned over the course of this podcast series is, really shifting away from that instant gratification of kinetic outcomes to a much slower but steady and competition kind of an outlay is something that we are maybe not good at, but we need to get over ourselves and get good at it.
Yeah, absolutely. That and that was kind of one of my recommendations was, how do we, well, first we have to fool ourselves into believing that this stuff works. It's not even fool, it's truth. But how do we get ourselves, how do we leverage what little we have in the, terms of strategic patience, part of our strategic culture, to help kind of build that ability to play the longer game again. And in my case, I kind of focused on, OPSEC, denial of critical information to the enemy, is the second, is the other side of the coin from deception. In fact, it's usually referred to as denial and deception. And even if we're not always great at it, we at least have a little bit of a cultural seed in the OPSEC department. Every soldier knows, whether they're good at it or not, that OPSEC's important. And if we can build off of that, a culture of, honest consideration of deception in all operations, is possible. I think it's a good starting place.
Yeah. Well, excellent study, Stephen. Let's go into a quick lightning round, about 30 seconds to 1 minute per response, and then
Sure.
we'll close it out. Also related to your study. So lightning round, first lightning round, corporate competition.
I think we have a lot to learn from, the way corporations conduct, actually less corporations, more illicit organizations. I think we have a lot to learn from how illicit organizations functioning like corporations conduct their competitions, since they have to do it in a denied environment every day of the week. So I think there's a lot to be learned there. And actually, one of my compatriots actually did her MMAS on a very similar topic.
Awesome. Second lightning round, complex systems.
Sure. So that's one of the big things. Deception and competition is basically a big game of complex systems, and we're going to need to get used to being able to, probe, sense, and respond, vice planning with certainty, certain outcomes. Get used to working in a problem space that is irreducible, that we cannot just portion these things off into little pieces without losing, some greater essence of the overall problem. And that our current approach to steal a quote from an Air Force friend's, bin it to win it, just create a lot of different organizations to approach different problems, is problematic. And we're going to need to kind of get over that. Otherwise, we just make the complex system even bigger and worse.
Bin it to win it. I've never heard that before, but I really get what you're saying there. There is such a tendency to be like, OMG, this is a problem. Let's create a command or an outfit or something. Let's put together an organization to tackle this problem, and that might not be the way to go.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Last lightning round, information theory.
Sure. So first principles matter, even if they either seem too theoretical or too specific at first glance. And I think information theory is that first principle for deception, information operations, perception management, whatever you want to call it. And so when we end up, blinded by a wall of doctrinal or philosophical sophistry and nitpicking, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, information theory as first principles are a good fallback position for clarity. And I think even if we can't expect every soldier to be able to calculate the Shannon entropy of something, information professionals should be at least aware of the foundations of information theory.
Yeah, 100%. Closing out, could you recommend a good book or perhaps other online resource related to the kinds of things that we've been discussing that an interested listener might check out?
Sure. I actually have a few. I'll burn through them real quick.
Okay. Yeah.
Ralph D. Sawyer turned out to be a diamond in the rough. He has done a number of translations and commentaries on Chinese work of strategic literature. So not just The Art of War, but he's done a book called The Tao of Deception and another book called Lever of Power that very much do an interesting deep dive into Chinese strategic culture vis-a-vis deception and kind of their concept of shi or she, however you pronounce it. Bennett and Waltz do a very good book called Counter-Deception Principles and Applications for National Security. Even if counter-deception is not your kind of thing, the first half of the book is an excellent literature review on basically all research done in military deception over the last 70, 80 years. And then there's a book called A Theory of Fun for Game Design by Raf Koster that makes a very good case and a very easy to appreciate manner for why wargaming and game design is an effective teaching and learning tool. And then, finally, if your boss absolutely needs some historical reference, I think the book's called Playing War by a gentleman named Lillard that talks about how the Naval War College's incredible focus on wargaming was kind of the genesis of some of the major pieces of doctrine, like the Carrier Task Force and kind of how it helped them in World War II. Sorry, I know that was a little lengthy. I'm kind of known for reading way too much, often to my detriment.
No, that's good. I can't imagine reading too much is to someone's detriment, especially in the military art. What's next for you, Steve? Do you have like a new assignment following the Army Command and Staff College, or are you staying within your same reserve unit?
So I, in a fit of madness, applied for the School of Advanced Military Studies program. And I think just because they needed some extra reservists, they shockingly accepted me. So I will be here for another year, classes start in 2.5 weeks to do another master's. So yeah, I'll be here for SAMS for another year.
Excellent. All right. Well, wish you all the best, and perhaps another invite onto the podcast if you've got another readout from that effort. Would love to hear about what you're doing. And with that, Major Steve Schiovani, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Sir, my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.